Well, welcome to this Black History lunchtime conversation. I think this is, we're getting towards the end of season 2 now. We've had 22 excellent sessions so far, and we're really looking forward to Bakr Madden-El Shabazz telling us his story, which I think is going to be really interesting. So, Apu, I'm not going to say any more. I'm just going to ask you to introduce yourself and share your story.
Okay, thank you, Liz, and thanks everybody for tuning up. My story today, I'm going to be looking at my social or personal evolution into history and to become a historian. And I think I want to put a bit of a biography to it, etc., because I think it gives context to where I started and where I actually got to. So I think these are important factors in order to try to establish some sort of form of communication, some sort of understanding. It'll be an element of reflection as well for many of yourselves, because many of you may have taken similar journeys. And it's just a way of me introducing myself to you all. I'm a historian, I'm a self-trained historian. I've been studying history for over 46 years since I was a child. It's something which I was really into, and I'm going to display or present that within my narrative. I'm also a trained psychologist, sociologist, and anthropologist from Cardiff University School of Social Sciences. And I'm also an educational consultant. And we have just completed, as Liz has just mentioned, about looking at the Welsh curriculum. I was part of the working group with the Welsh Assembly government, looking how we can establish a multicultural education throughout the whole of Wales, because it's something that Black people have been fighting for over 70 years. It's something that we have been arguing for over 70 years. So I think that's important to lay that little bit of foundation. I also work for Kifili County Borough Council as an educator and as a counsellor, dealing with students who have mental health issues, special educational needs, and disruptive behavioural disorders. Because I come from probably a similar type of background myself as a youngster, so I have that lived experience, and I feel I can do something to help the next generation become more productive citizens within Welsh society or within the global situation. So that's basically an introduction from me. So let's make a start. So my journey as a historian really begins at home. There's a picture of me, of my father. I'm about 9 to 10 years old at that time. My stepmother already purchased for me approximately a 10-volume book, which was actually for adults. So my stepmother, in some way, even though she was an educated woman, my father couldn't read or write, neither could my mother. But my stepmother wanted to give me that element of a head start, I suppose, because she was educated in this country. And I suppose she wanted to ensure that I was going to become, if I was going to be challenged in the educational system, I'd be able to hold my own, as they would say. So she bought me these encyclopedias at the age of 8 years old. And I loved these encyclopedias. And there was also a massive, huge dictionary that came with these encyclopedias. And I memorized a lot of words within these dictionaries. So my education really started really and truly as early as 7 and 8. So what I want to emphasize here, the importance that children's education should really start at the home. And that's what happened with me before I actually went to school or when I was going to school. So that's where it begins. This book you see on the right-hand side was the first history book that she bought me. I was about 11 years old when she bought me for Christmas. So there was something that she knew about me, obviously. There must have been an interest I must have had. And I think that came as a result of many of the TV programs and documentaries I was watching as a young child. And I always had an issue and problems watching these historical documentaries, say, for instance, of the place of Black people and African people. Because at the time in the 1970s, there was still a few countries which was under colonization of the British or the French and the Portuguese. And I really wanted to try to find the place of Black people. Where is their empires? Where is their civilizations? Because I really didn't see that, but I knew it existed somehow because those encyclopedias she gave me some sort of hints. Even though it was whitewashed over, to a large extent. They were still remnants of the contribution, the achievements and accomplishments of Black people, which was detailed in some of that information. So this book was given to me at the age of 11, between the age of 11 and 12. There's also an image of me. I was part of the Welsh boxing team, which was called the Prince of Wales. I was the first Black boxer to be selected to fight for Wales. And I was also the youngest as well. I was 12 years old. So this is a picture of the Welsh team. This is the first multicultural Welsh boxing team in the whole of Wales. And I was part of that team. I started boxing at the age of 7 years old, and I did it for approximately 10 years, because at the time we lived in a middle class, a working middle class area. There was hardly any Black people, and it was a way of me trying to learn how to defend myself, because when I used to go to the shop, I was chased by a group of white boys, etc. I couldn't fight. I was a good runner, and I learned how to become a good runner. And maybe this is why most of us are good with sports, with running, because the amount of chases we used to have as young kids growing up in the UK. So this is just an image of me. And the trainer here, or the chairman here, his name was Tommy George, took me under his wing. He taught me how to box. He actually fought Henry Cooper before Henry Cooper went on to fight Muhammad Ali. He was a professional boxer. And he decided to create this club called the Prince of Wales, which is in Grangetown in Cardiff. And you can see the mixture of people. There's people who are mixed race. There's people there who are mixed Portuguese, Maltese, mixed Italians, half Somali, yeah. And the list just goes on. African Caribbean, mixed Caribbean, there's even Welsh. It was a complete multicultural. So that was the first time I actually learned that multiculturalism could work, literally. So there is those principles and foundations which were laid very early on in my life. And this was the fight I did after that picture was actually taken. That picture which you just saw, which was taken, was actually taken in a student union in Cardiff University. So that might have been telling me something, like, you know, that could have been telling me something. Even though I was a boxer and I was fighting at Cardiff University in the student union, I would probably go on to become maybe a lecturer at the university and maybe studying there. So sometimes things come into our lives, and maybe they may have been the initial seeds planted in order to establish, you know, someone's future. So I think this is important for us to know, that sometimes when children are exposed to certain things, they could be the precursors to their evolutionary development. Now, this was one of the books I read. This was given to me by my older brother. My older brother was a Rastafarian back in the day, and he was very conscious. And I was trying to look for the presence, the positive contribution, achievements, and accomplishments of Black people. It gave me this book, approximately 1989, to read. It was very difficult to read because I didn't have any prior knowledge of high African cultures or civilizations. And I read this book, and what I started noticing, I started to develop my knowledge about ancient African history, which was one of those sort of subjects that was missing from the ancient world. And I grounded myself in this. I've gone through approximately 6 copies, because pages have fallen out since that time, you know, and this is the copy which I have now. So what I want to emphasize about this particular point here is that I've had people around me nurturing me, you know, planting those seeds, encouraging me. And this is what is important for children, I feel, for them to gain something later on in life. Even though my father and my mother were a bit ignorant to a large extent about Caribbean history, and that was a lot to do with the fact that they had a British colonial education. They knew about the Tudors and the Stuarts and the Charleses and all these other groups of people, First World War, Second World War. But when it came time of me trying to inquire about myself and my identity, there was this sort of dislocation. You're not a West Indian, you're not a Jamaican, you were born in this country, you're an English boy. You know, this is what was given. And this is why Rastafarianism, I suppose, as a movement was very, very reviving to us, in a sense, because it gave us a sense of identity, and we wanted to go back to Africa. And there was a split within the Caribbean households where you actually had West Indians and African Caribbeans. And what I mean by African Caribbeans, we wanted to be identified as African Caribbeans. And as a result of the Rastafarian movement, there's not a single which was not produced where they wouldn't glamorize and talk about Africa in a positive way. And this is what dismantled a lot of colonization. It was African Caribbeans, it was mainly the Jamaicans, mainly primarily, along with other Caribbean groups, that kept alive the element of colonization and colonialism in Africa. So if it wasn't for the music industry of reggae music and ska and lovers rock and all these other type of things, the awareness of Africa and our connection to Africa would not have been inevitable. So we have to understand the importance of the revolutionary movement and the intellectual tradition that came out of Rastafari. This was the first book, or one of the first books that I had purchased, because I was also interested in South Africa. I wanted to understand more about the apartheid movement, but I wanted to know about South Africa before the coming of the Boers and the British and the Portuguese and the Arabs and all these other groups of people, because I always knew that African people were lived in isolations for thousands upon thousands of years before there was contact with any outsider. I was aware of this reality because I had studied prehistory, and so elements in prehistory gave me that type of information. And the other thing that I want to elaborate further upon this, because 1992 was a critical moment in British history. And what I mean by that, this was going to be the celebration of the quincentenary celebration, which many of you might remember, where Europe or the British were going to celebrate 500 years of success. 500 except because they defeated the Moors in 1492, and in 1992 they were going to celebrate their 500-year victory. I was against this celebration, and I think this is when my journey to become a historian had been established. When I was talking to many Caribbean people about reality and the atrocities that took place in the conquistadores and Christopher Columbus and Balboa and Cortes and Vasco da Gama and all these so-called explorers and so-called discoverers, people thought I was on a different wavelength. They couldn't understand what I was talking about. And it was at that moment, as early as 1991, when I decided to take it upon myself that I was going to become a historian. I was going to study every single discipline out there which reflected the Black experience and try to extract from that the positive elements, because I believe this is what my people needed in order for us to propel ourselves into the 21st century. And this is a book which I purchased and I read between 1992 and 1993. So you can see there was a lot of things taking place in the media, which was highlighting the aspect of Black people and African people and their place in the world. And then I bought this book round about 1990. And this is the first book which I read from cover to cover. When I picked up this book, I didn't know what was in there. I just saw Black people fighting the French. That's all and I bought it. And it took about 6 months before I actually opened it and read it. And when I read it, it totally blew my mind. It was the first time I actually read a book from cover to cover. I picked it up, started reading it, and I couldn't put it down. It was just like I was watching a television, movie or a history program, a documentary. And that's the first time it happened to me. I was totally in awe with what this book had to say. And The Black Jacobins, in a sense, by most of you will know this book by C.L.R. James. It's a classic in English literature, looking at the Haitian Revolution and their pushing out or the kicking out of the French during the time of Napoleon. And it's because of this revolution why the Louisiana Purchase had gone through. Because they bankrupted the French economy, this revolution that lasted for approximately 12 years. And then the likes of Toussaint Louverture and the likes of Dessalines and Henry Christophe, there was a lot of different groups of people. Even women were part of this movement as well. And this is what I found very inspiring. And the first people to go over there, what attracted my attention to this book, being a Jamaican, was that the likes of Bookman actually originally came from Jamaica. And he was kicked out of Jamaica because he was starting revolutions and rebellions in Jamaica. So they kicked him over to Haiti. And through that spirit which he had, the likes of Bookman, which means a man of the book, okay? He wrote his own book. So he was a literate individual. And when he actually sent to San Domingo, what we now call Haiti, he, along with other groups of people, inspired the Haitian Revolution. Okay, you've got to understand at this particular time, the French had just gone through their so-called revolution, known as liberation. But the Africans or the Black people in this small Caribbean islands are talking about, well, why is it that the white people are talking about their liberation and not talking about ours, and they're still keeping us in slaves? It was the most and the only successful slave revolution in the whole of history. And they were the first independent state. And Haiti has suffered since this time. But I just wanted to give you understand that this is the book that propelled me and showed me that slaves, abolished slavery themselves. It was not based upon the abolition movements, through the ballot. This is through the bullet. And this was the first time that this really opened up to me. So that's when it took me on to another aspect of trying to understand the reality of Black history and my people. Then later on, I brought this book. It's called The Slave Trade. I think he's a Welsh author. So he's certainly got a Welsh name, even if he might have been born in England. So this is a book which I bought between 1997 and 1999. And what I started doing, I started buying a lot of books. I would go into cheap shops, and this was a discontinued book. And if you know about discontinued books, to be discontinued rather, these are books which are not to the standard that they should be after publication. So when it goes to the print, certain things may happen. Maybe pages are stuck together, or there may be pages that came upside down, whatever the case may be. Or it could be a sense where some of the pages, some of the ink in the pages are faded. So they can't sell that as a quality standard book within many of the bookshops. So I would go to some of these places to buy these books. And this is a book which I bought. I still have the book now. I think there's probably about 900 pages, and this laid the foundation really and truly. I was really impressed with the book, and it gave me some other elements of all the different slave traders that came into being. And it's still a book I use now as far as references is concerned. Obviously, when I read it at the time, I didn't completely understand it. But as time goes on, you read and you increase your knowledge, it becomes more relevant and it becomes more understandable. Then I started to look more at what the slave rebellions were about. I came away from like the abolition movement, for the ballot, and go more for the bullet. Slaves liberated themselves, because this was a narrative I felt that was missing. And it's still missing to a large extent. Whenever they have these anniversaries, looking at the slave trade of 1807, or the abolition of slavery, which took place in 1833 or 1834, based upon the dates that you like to associate with, it's always about the abolition of what white people did. And I want to see what we did. We didn't just sit there and do nothing. So my brother was the one who told me, if you're really interested in this, read this book by this Jamaican author. Okay, his name is Richard Hart. He published many books, but these are 2-volume books which I bought, volume 1 and 2, Slaves Who Abolished Slavery, and that just absolutely blew my mind. So I already had read The Black Jacobins by C.L.R. James, and this was just another form of information that started to give more strength and authenticity and the collaboration that slaves had with themselves, with former slaves, to overthrow the British occupation in Jamaica. And this is a quincentenary celebration from 1492 to 1992. The Europeans, of every 100 years, they celebrate this. This is their victory over the Moors. The Moors were dark-skinned people that lived in the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, for 800 years. They brought 17 universities throughout the whole of Europe. The first time that was done, they were public universities. Women had social equality with men. This never happened anywhere in Europe at all. This is what made this the major standard. If you go to Spain today on holiday, they never show you on their advertisements for tourism anything that the Spanish did. All they show you is what the Moors did. So even though they defeated the Moors, they used our monuments as dark-skinned people in order to promote their country. Okay, but they will not even acknowledge who the Moors were. They like to hide it, saying they were Muslims, light-skinned Muslims. No, Moor means black. That's what the word Moor comes from, because the word Maurice or Moros from the Latin or the Greek, which means dark or black. That's what it meant. And the word Moor was used as early as 46 BC. This is 700 years before the Muslims. So it had to be an adjective to describe a people. not a religious group. And we know about Sir Maurice and Sir Morian, who were Christians. These are Christians, so they are Black Christians who were revered within Europe. So these were just some of the films or the propaganda which they were trying to come out with, Black Robe, 1492. Because this is when I started waking up. This is when I started to feel that they were celebrating the genocide of Native Americans and Black people. And even though they're supposed to have abolished the slave trade in 1807 and slavery in 1833 or 1834, why is Britain celebrating this? Why are you celebrating the inception of slavery, but then you claim that this was confusing to me. Then I started to realize the hypocrisy in historiography and historicity. So that's when I decided to actually go on the front line in order to ensure that the reality of history be kept in an order that people like myself and my people would be able to understand, because I started to acknowledge its propaganda. So that's what happened with movies. Movies was now adding to this thing. So the reality here is that they were just reinforcing the old narratives. And there was very little challenge coming from us in this country. There was a lot of protests in the Caribbean islands. There was a lot of protests in Canada in 1991, 1992, with people against this celebration in places like Peru and Venezuela and in Brazil and all those Latin American countries. There was a massive amount of protests between 1991 and 1992 to stop the Europeans from celebrating. Because we as people saw it as the beginning of enslavement, colonization, and genocide. Then there was one film which was made, was Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, and they had made sure that they wanted Morgan Freeman to play the Moor. So a Moor means a Black person. So this was my beginning of understanding who the Moors were. They had brought civilization and culture to Europe, science and technology, mathematics. The numeral system we use today came from the Moors, from 1 to 0. The decimal point in the 0, which was actually founded in ancient Kemet, Nubia, that went over by Thutmose III into Asia, landed in India, and the decimal point and the 0 was then reintroduced in Europe by the so-called Moors or Muslims at that particular time. Because Moor and Black as Arabs were dark skinned at that time as well. Obviously, when they migrated into other places, they started to become more mixed. They're mixed race now, the Arabs. That's what they are. They have Turkish and Slavic and Roman and Germanic people. That's what they are. Even though they speak the Arabic language, etc., they are mulattoes or mixed. History testifies to that. Okay, so we know who the original ones were. So this is Morgan Freeman playing the Moor, and there's a lot of scientific innovations in the film, which I won't talk about. That could be talked about another time. But this is to show you, this took place, this was the essence that was coming out in 1991, 1992, 1993, the quincentenary celebration, okay? So this was actually showing a Moor in a positive light. This is what this was about, showing what a Moor looked like in a positive light, even though in 1492, they had defeated the Moors. Then an intellectual debate took place where a lot of Black scholars from the Caribbean, as well as America, started to challenge the narrative that Christopher Columbus did not discover the so-called New World or the Americas, because according to his dictionaries, or according to his, not dictionaries, his diaries, he never stepped foot on North or South America. So which Americas did he stand on? These are myths. And it was challenged by the likes of Edward Scobie from Dominica, Jan Carew from Guyana, Leonard Jeffries from America, John Henry Clark, Dr. Tony Martin from Trinidad, Dr. Ben Ronoko Rashidi from America, okay? Ivan van Sertima. He actually went to Congress to argue this case, that you can't say that the discoveries of Columbus was a discovery. The most you can do is contact, because he had written a book in the 1970s, mid to late 1970s. It was called They Came Before Columbus, where he actually shows linguistic and artifacts, physical artifacts of African presence in North America, South America, and Central America before the Europeans. And this made things very uncomfortable. So we started to see where Black scholars from the Caribbean and America were going into universities now, studying and specializing in the African experience. And what they were doing was uncovering the different types of falsifications that Europeans would engage in. They were hiding artifacts and things within the university complexes. Okay, they started to suppress information, destroy information, distort information. Okay, and to intentionally confuse. And they started to engage in this what they call what is known as transubstantiation. Transubstantiation means whenever there's a Black or African presence, they put European characters there. Just like what took place with Cecil B. DeMille's film Moses. The only people who were slaves are the Black people, and the white people are the... No, this is not true. We know this is not true. Archaeological evidence has substantiated this. Also, the linguistic evidence in the hieroglyphics, what we call Medinecha, has established this, that white people since 1492 onwards have deliberately tried to falsify information. And these were the scholars of the early 1990s who took on the best Europeans, okay, and put them in their place. And this is when Black Studies program, which started in the mid to late 1960s, started to utilize those social spaces in which European scholars have been fabricating the history about Black people and wanted to keep us in this 500-year room because they never like to look beyond 1492. Even today, every Black History Month that you have seen or you've experienced, have a look at the images of Black people. All they will talk about is all pathological issues: slavery, discrimination. If they talk about abolition, is about white people feeling this. It's never about our emancipation from bottom up. It's always top down, and so on and so forth. They are still controlling the narrative and still perpetuating that type of falsification. So this is what I want you to acknowledge about these different scholars who came out on their own. Even Black people didn't really support them, but they were able to uncover a lot of the literature which was out there. So this is Ivan van Sertima again. He wrote this book, The Golden Age of the Moor, looking at it from an Afrocentric, because we know the Moors were dark-skinned people. You can't whitewash them. This is what the Europeans have been trying to do. Because it's amazing how they defeat the Moors in 1492, and it's the same year where Columbus comes into contact, and he takes the first bunch of slaves who were Moors to places like Jamaica, Trinidad, Barbados, Virgin Islands, and all these places, and then he calls them Maroons. From Moors, we become Maroons. Maroons comes from a Spanish word, Cimarrone, which means wild or untamed. These are the ones they couldn't control, or they couldn't forcibly convert to Catholicism, because this is when the Inquisition started. So this is the beginning of the history where Europeans, unfortunately, want to start us. They do not want to start us before that, because before that, we were involved in science and technology, cartographers, sailing. We controlled the Atlantic at that time, trade and commerce, the amount of gold that was coming out of West Africa into North Africa, into Europe, which they were minting, and all these different type of things, they tried to push to one side. So it's important here for us to understand the contributions, the achievements, and accomplishments of dark-skinned people before the enslavement period, during the enslavement period, and after. So this was another book which I started to get into to try to find out who the Moors were, because I noticed there was a whitewashing of what was taking place. This is a book which I took out by Stanley Lane Poole called The Moors in Spain. You can see the image there, who the Moors were. They tried to, a lot of white scholars would look at the Moors, etc., literally tried to whitewash it. Just like the ancient Egyptians, they can't whitewash the ancient Nubians because the people who live in places like Nubia or Sudan today are still the same color. And this is why they do it. North Africa is a mulatto nation. We know this because when you go back further and further, before colonization, there were African Berbers that was in control before the Berlin Conference. This is historical fact. It wasn't the lighter skin. And when the French went in, they moved the lighter skin mulattoes up to the top, and the darker skinned people moved down in the ratings within North Africa. That's why North Africa is the way it is today, through colonization by the French. And they put in place what we now would call a pigmentocratic system, a system based upon skin color. The lighter skinned people at the top, darker skinned people at the bottom. They even have people believing that the Berber are the white people. The Berbers are not the white people. A Berber language is an African language. Those of you in linguistics would know this. And they say that the Berbers are Caucasian. Caucasus Mountains is not in Africa. So if you call them Caucasian, They must have come from the Caucasus Mountains into that place. But do you see what they do? They always like to attribute the achievements and accomplishments of Black people to whites. They do the same with Carthage in Tunisia, etc. I don't have an image of Hannibal to show you who he is, but the reality, he was an African. They try to whitewash him, so that is what they do. Whenever there's contribution, achievement, and accomplishment by Black people, they always whitewash it, unfortunately, and they still perpetuate and make movies and films to try to reinforce those notions. But they're being exposed now, and especially with DNA and science, you know, that's actually showing us what is really happening. So these are just some of the things of looking at the Moors. Could we look at the Moors in places like Baghdad? There's one Arab, this is an Arab man by the name of Al-Jahid, okay? He was an individual who had studied. This particular Arab person in Iraq at the time, all this person would do was profusely read. He would hire out bookshops in the night, okay? And he would literally read and make notes and all these other things. The thing with this individual, he is known as the Father of Zoology. He actually wrote, I think it's a 7-volume book. At the age, he was in his 60s when he wrote this book. In his 60s when he wrote this book, he's known as the Father of Zoology. And he had actually looked at the psychology of animals, the biological and physiological elements of animals, and looking at how animals should be treated, how they should be kept, and the different types of communication they have. This is how advanced this individual was at that time. This goes back over 1,000 years ago. This is important, over 1,000 years ago. So this is why Europeans, unfortunately, had to keep us in this 500-year room. Because if we go beyond that, we do begin to see our contribution, achievements, and accomplishments. And then obviously this is another thing, looking at the Moors. George G.M. James wrote a book called Stolen Legacy. After he wrote that, looking how the Greeks stolen information from the Africans, and in some incidents tried to attribute to themselves, so they plagiarized philosophy. Later, when he wrote this book, etc., this man mysteriously died. So they believe that he was a person who was really beginning to expose aspects about the falsification of history. Now, I'm not going to read all through this, but what he's basically saying, there was a relationship with the ancient Kemetic people, the ancient Egyptians, and the North Africans. And the North Africans had major relationships with West Africans. So when Islam came in the 7th century, these Africans, which inherited, became custodians of Egyptian knowledge, because you know about the Dogon and Sirius B and planetary systems they can see with their naked eye that only master telescopes can identify today. This is the type of knowledge that Africans had in antiquity. So what I'm showing here is the importance that there was an interlink between Egypt or ancient Egypt, North Africa, West Africa. Because when you look at these Egyptologist programs, do you notice that when they talk about Egypt, they look at Egypt or modern day Egypt today, and then they go into the Levant. They go this way, where the people become lighter. Do you notice they never go westwards? They always go to the east. This is falsification of history. It makes it look like Egypt was an isolated country, had no relationship whatsoever with people west of them or north of them. So this is just to show you that the custodians of information of ancient Kemet that went into Central Africa, went into West Africa, went into North Africa, had maintained that information for thousands of years. And then they were able to bring that in to the Iberian Peninsula, the Tariq ibn Ziyad in 711. And that's when they were able to introduce universities and science, technology, and everything you could think of for 800 years. That's how long the Moors were in there. Black people were controlling and ruling Europe when they were in their dark ages. And many of European kings would send their children to be educated by Black people, and they would bring that information back, but usually plagiarize, not tell the people where they got the information. And this is why the Inquisition was the way it was. A lot of people don't like to talk about this fact that they were taking knowledge from these dark-skinned people, which they were calling infidels. And that's why the Catholic Church are doing things to the likes of Galileo and Copernicus and all these other individuals, because they were taking knowledge from these so-called heathens. This is how scientifically advanced these people were. So you've got the likes of Ziryab. He's another person. He comes into Al-Andalus, known as Spain and Portugal, around about the 8th century, about the 9th century, 800s. And this is what this man, this African, or this African Moor, or black Moor Muslim slash whatever you want to say, but he's a black person. This is what he introduces into Europe, which is still with us today now. So he was born, he was a botanist, he used to create perfumes, etc. He comes into Al-Andalusia in 822. Okay, he was profusely he used to study the understanding of bacteria, etc., because hygiene was really important to the Moors. This is really important. This is why there's so many bathhouses in Al-Andalus. When Europe was sunk into depravity, where hygiene was concerned. If you don't believe me, read the book by Terence McLaughlin. It's called Dirt, and he will break down what was taking place in Britain and in France during the time of the Moors, and what was taken in those places right up until the 1800s. This is important here. So the Moors were very, very thin when it came to hygiene. He also introduced into Europe autumn and spring. There was only winter and summer. Okay, he was a fashion designer as well. So it's not as if the clothes was something that was given to women to do. Clothes was something that men were involved in, creating fabrics and trading in cotton and all these other different things and making this material. So you may see a gendered, stratified element when it came to clothes, but men were also involved in those clothes as well. And when he looked at fashion, he was the one which identified that thinner clothes should be worn in the summer and thicker clothes in the winter. It was Zidab, it was this mold that introduces into Europe. And if you go to New York, France, or London, New York, Paris, or London, the same thing that this mold had established over 1,000 years ago is being used in fashion understandings even till today. But they never like to quote who they got it from. They like to keep us in this 500-year route. Okay, he created different hairstyles, etc. He was the first one to introduce into Europe, the first person to build into Europe a college, a hair and beauty college. So the hair and beauty colleges you see in today's society was founded by a man, not a woman, by a man who happened to be black, which was he was an African Arab. So this is important for us to know, because what we have done, we've literally tried, we've plagiarized a lot of stuff in Europe and not trying to identify or track back where these things came from. He was a person to introduce the three-course meal amongst the aristocracy. So what it was a soup to start off with, then an entree, a fish, a meat dish with vegetables and some form of carbohydrates. That's where they were stolen from this mall. And obviously, to finish off, you had what was known as dessert, which probably comes from the word, which is probably related to the word desert. Dessert, desert. This is probably what it is. So sometimes in linguistics, there's some sort of last traces within words of where they came from. And we know white people originally didn't come from desert places. You know, darker skinned people was they would have burnt up, caught cancer, because of the ultraviolet rays of the sun, etc., etc. And he was also the first person to create leather mats to put plates on, so the tables wouldn't be scratched. Okay, whether they were using glass or wood or expensive wood. There's a wisdom behind all these things that he came. The reason why he invented the three-course meal was because in the course of Al-Andalus, when these blacks were eating, etc., there was opulence and extravagance, and tons of food was literally thrown away. So it was a way of recycling and reducing the amount of food, because they knew further up in the north that the people in Europe were literally starving. And this is a fact, because of the bubonic plagues and all these different other things taking place. And he's trying to look more of this area outside the area for us to know that food is a blessing from God. So we should appreciate food, and we should reduce as much waste as possible. This is how all this came about. He introduced asparagus into Europe. The Moors also introduced rice into Europe. The Moors also introduced, these Africans introduced lemons, limes, and oranges. And Portugal was probably one of the best places where oranges. They now believe that the word oranges come from the word oranges, or orange, in Arabic is called Portugal, 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 Portugal. So we can see these linguistic tracings, etc., where these Black people are brought into Europe, and they allowed the Catholics and the Jews to practice their religion. This is what is important here, because Protestantism, when the Bible was reduced to 66 books, that didn't come until the 1500s. So the Moors would only deal with the Catholics. There was no Protestants at that time. Okay, this is Jews and Catholics. They were the Christians at that time. They were allowed to keep their language. They were allowed to keep their social order, their legal system, judicial system, etc. They didn't go in and destroy. And this is what's really important. If they did, Spain and Portugal wouldn't be advertising Moorish monuments and architectures in their tourist magazines. This is what's important here. So he also invented the first phase of washing powder. So all of you would have used something that came out of a black mart today. You would have either used washing powder, toothpaste, soap, or deodorant. This is the first thing that was introduced into Europe by Ziryab into the aristocratic realms, as well as the low realms, which took place within Portugal and Spain. And then eventually by the 17 and 1800s, they started to get utilized and facilitated within European countries. So we must remember that we always have to go back to the original sources. Where do we get these things from today? You know, the washing and the bathhouses, the use of deodorants and washing powder, because they used to wear a lot of white, and it was hot and sticky, etc. So they had to bath regular. Okay, the brushing of the teeth, you know, deodorant because of sweat. This is what this man has created. So this is a type of innovative knowledge that darker skinned people was involved in at the time before the so-called Inquisition. And then we see the fall of Boabdil in 1492. So this is Ferdinand and Isabella, and obviously you've got Boabdil or Abu Abdullah, or the last ruler, Moorish ruler in Granada. And this is the beginning now of Columbus, Balboa, and Cortes, and all these other individuals who's going to go out to explore or so-called to discover. And that's how that comes about. Then round about this time, when Columbus is going on his discoveries, the Pope was the most powerfulest man in the world. He had divided the world into two because Spain and Portugal were fighting one another. So under the Treaty of Tordesillas, what he decided to do is divide the world into two. He gave half the world to Spain and half the world to Portugal. So Portugal on the equatorial line here in 1494 were given Brazil, Africa, and Asia. This is important here, which meant that Spain could not go into Africa now after 1494. This is why Brazil is Portuguese speaking today. This is why most of the countries in West Africa have got Portuguese language, like Niger and Nigeria. Nigeria, it's not Nigeria, it's not a J, it's a G. Niger means black. But we know that that was used profusely during slavery, while we try to abandon this. But the country was called, though that area was called Niger, not Niger. We turned the J to G. So even African countries, which are derogatory in its terminology or its phrase, it's still being used today because they don't understand where these linguistic expressions come from. Even when Flora Shaw was in Nigeria, that's what she called it. Read her book. She called it Niggerland. That's a translation of Nigeria, Niggerland. That's what she called it. Read her book, Tropical Independence or Independency. And then you get a better idea of what I'm talking about. So Portugal was given Brazil, Africa, and Asia, because the Portuguese was in places like the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, and all those places long before the Dutch and the British got there. This is important here. This is history. You're looking at the latter part of the 1400s. And Spain was basically given everything besides this, which was South America, Central America, North America, Canada, and the Caribbean islands. This is why a lot of these countries today still speak Spanish. Okay? So that's how that was divided. France, Britain, Holland, and all these other countries didn't like this at all. Why? Because what happened, most of them became Protestant after 1517. So the Pope was really doing with his two boys, you know, I give half the world to you, Spain, and half the world to Portugal, to stop them from fighting. Because they said, look, there's a lot of resources, minerals, and commodities on these lands, as well as other resources, which is slaves. which we can use now to develop the land, because they knew very little in agriculture, they knew very little in creating certain tools for agriculture, whatever the case may be. Because under the Moors and the Africans and the Arabs, say for instance, they had revolutionized industry, and they were now going to create their industries on the backs of other people in the so-called New World. So these are just some of the courses that I taught. I ended up writing a proposal to Cardiff University, and when I graduated in 2008, I decided to write a proposal, and the same year I wrote the proposal, it was accepted. It was the same year that Obama came into power. So that might have been one of the reasons why I ended up working at Cardiff University, even though I did a lot of work in Cardiff University as an undergraduate student. Now, these are just some of the courses which I taught, because the dates are on there. It's only 10-week courses. It went to a degree level. So this was a course that I wrote and I delivered, which was known as the Kings of Mother Africa, looking at high culture of Africans. I looked at Carthage, I looked at Egypt, I looked at Mali, Songhai, I also looked at Nubia, and I also looked at Kush. And I didn't just look at Kush in Africa, I looked at Kush in Arabia, and I also looked at Kush, which is mentioned in the Bible, referring to Mesopotamia of the Sumerian civilization. This is important here, because they've even tried to whitewash Sumerian civilization. So this was what I studied. I was the only lecturer at Cardiff University who was allowed to teach outside my fields. Other lecturers were only allowed to teach within their prescribed fields. So I was allowed to teach anthropology, sociology, psychology. I taught educational psychology, child development, and that's something which they felt I was able to do. So I really appreciate that Cardiff University saw my talent and they allowed me to teach outside my realm. And there was a lot of professors in the university who was a little bit envious of that. This is why, even though many of you may know me as a historian, you'll notice I will speak on things which are anthropological, sociological, psychological. I also taught economics. So I'm a multidisciplinary expert. Like I said, in 1992, I had made it, I made an oath with myself. I'm going to study every single discipline in order to find the positive elements of Black people, whether they were Black or African, mixed race, whatever the case may be. And I made sure that I stood that ground. I have read over 5,000 works. From 1992 onwards, I've read over 5,000 works on different things, mainly from European scholars, ancient literature, etc. And I have a large library in my house, and I have read as much things as I could on different subjects. So it's not easy to place me in a subject. Even though I'm known as a historian, I'm a little bit more than that. I'm also a trained psychotherapist. I'm also a counselor as well. I also specialize in educational needs. So I can train teachers how they can deal with adult learners or children learners who suffer with dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, or hyperlexia. Okay, how they can increase their instruction to make it more effective for delivery and for retention levels within adult learners or children learners. So I'm not just a historian. Okay, I'm a bit more than that, etc. The history, I suppose, is my foundation. This is another course which I did. It did have a bit of controversy from some of the scholars because I'm going to teach on Black Egypt. When they saw my proposal, they were convinced because I used DNA to prove my point, because they watched many films and many things were whitewashed. They were the people who accepted my proposal were okay with my proposal. It was many of the other professors who were against it because, all you do is talk about Black things and Black people and all these other type of things. This is the way I was attacked, and I was literally on my own. I didn't really get the support from the community, from the Black community, etc. So I've had to intellectually spar with intellectuals and professors and people who claim to be authorities on my people's past. I had to spar with them intellectually, and I now have gained the respect of these individuals because I'm not teaching a Black power type of philosophy to exclude white people, not the way they did it with us. I teach it based upon facts, honesty. I try to use whatever disciplines and sources that are out there to prove my points, which usually I try to go to their sources and use it against them. This is what I had to do. And they were convinced and they were quite happy with that course I ran. Then I looked at the rise and fall of the Moorish and Islamic Empire, because like I said, there was Moors who were Christian. This is important here. So Moors are not Muslim. Moors is a black person, whether they're Christian, Muslim, atheist, whatever the case. That's what Moor meant back then. So that was another 10-week course, part of the degree program, which I was teaching in order to show the black positive aspect. Because I wanted to come out of the slavery room that Europeans like to lock us in and go more to our contribution. This is where I found most of my opposition, coming from so-called intellectuals and scholars. Then this was the catalyst which I put together. I had to teach myself genetic science. I had to teach myself osteological measurements, craniology. This is what I had to do. I bought so much books looking at these things to try, and even till today, I can tell you the narrative of your DNA. If you're so much percent this and so much percent that, I can tell you when that genetic marker mutated and how the people looked. And most of the people, so if you have 34%, as an example, of European stock, it doesn't mean it's a European that looks like you. No, it's an African which mutated genetically in Europe. That's what it is. And these are the games that geneticists are playing. I was asked by what you call it now, the Galton Institute or something to come and do, because I was the first person to do a course on race and genetics at Cardiff University, deliver it. I used 11 different disciplines: paleontology, paleanthropology, anthropology, craniology, osteology. I looked at melanin. I taught myself all these different things because I had to withstand the criticism that was coming from white professors who were trying to say that I was teaching a false history. And as soon as I got into this and taught myself this, they left me alone. They said, this person has done his research. He's done his research. He knows what he's talking about, and we can't refute it. And this is what happens. So this was the course which I did. So I looked at the evolution of how to trace your genetic markers. I looked at two genes. I looked at mitochondrial DNA, which is passed from mother to daughter. And I looked at their movements and how they would have looked at that particular time. And I also looked at Y chromosomal DNA composition, which is transferred from the father to son, or from a man to a boy. This is what I've done. And what happened, unfortunately, after I'd done this course, two of the people which were sat on the course were in the room. They were working for either ITV or BBC. They stole my work, gave it to Eddie Izzard, the comedian, and they were using the same things that I had permission for. I had permission with many of the things, many of the images and monuments, and they used that on the documentary program that he did too. He looked at mitochondrial DNA. It was the first time this was done on Y chromosomal material. I was the first person in the UK, or in Wales at least, to teach this. And this information by two students was stolen. It was given to the BBC, and they didn't recognize my contribution. I've been studying genetics and DNA as early as 1990. And then I had to teach myself all these other different disciplines to substantiate and prove, because this is what you have to do as African or Black scholars now. We have to prove our point. We got to go into so many different disciplines, etc. You know, when they do it, they just say it. It's pseudo-scientific and is accepted. That's the unfortunate thing. And I always have to bring it back to white scholars, because if you know about the history of Africa, you know that they came in, they destroyed libraries. You know, in 146 BC, the Romans came in and they destroyed the Library of Carthage. Over 500,000 volumes were put in flames. And two major destructions took place in Egypt. You know, one destruction that took place around about between 46 to 48 BC of Cleopatra. Almost 500,000 volumes were destroyed. Yeah, during the time of Cleopatra. And we also know what happened with Emperor Theodosius, when he went in and he destroyed and he sacked the Library of Alexandria and took most of those books, religious texts, back to what was known as Constantinople. So Africa went through destruction. So the unfortunate thing about African history is that we've got to go to Roman sources and Greek sources for our primary sources, because the destruction of Indo-Europeans that came into Africa had literally destroyed the literature that had been housed for thousands of years. And that is the unfortunate reality. And then I obviously looked at Black history, the international struggle for freedom. That was looking more at slavery and resistance, etc., which I tried to move away from, because that's what I started from, just to get people involved. And then obviously things started to change. But I'm just going to finish off now of my academic journey, and then I'll finish and I'll open up for questions and answers. So thanks for your patience, everybody. So I went back into education. I had an element of hyperlexia. When I went into school, I was a precocious child, but because I was seen as a threat, they put me in a special class, special needs class in school, and I was teaching other kids how to read. This is how I was used in the educational system. And when I went into secondary school, they put me directly in the remedials when I was the top of my school. This is how I was treated by the educational system in Wales. And this is why I'm very, very passionate about history and education and just doing the right thing by pupils or by adults. So I went back to do my course. I want to go on to university. I started the access course. Somebody told me in a presentation I did in 1995 that I should go to university. I'm very articulate and confident and competent as a speaker. I thought I was too old. I was in my 20s at that time. Yeah, I thought I was too old. And then I did the access course from 2001 to 2004 in order to go to university. And these are just some of the university mates, university access students who went back as mature students in order to try to change their lives around. Many of these people in this photograph, I know it's not clear, many people in this photograph, they had children at the age of 14 and 15, maybe 2 or 3 children by the time they were 20. Some of them were on drugs. So this is what happened with the access course. The access course gave life to people like ourselves who didn't do too well in school. But the access course, which most people don't know, was actually what the British government was giving to the African Caribbean community because of this treatment we had by being put in remedial classes in schools. That's what the access course was for. It was a form of reparations for Black people. But the most people that went on the access course were white women. So that's a bit of history about the access course and how that came about. Now, I was doing a presentation. I had to write an interdisciplinary study, and I was going to look at the mental conditions of Black people under slavery and after slavery. So I was looking at things. I was looking at the concept of post-traumatic slave disorder, even before the thing was even coined. So I was ahead of myself in to a large extent. Now I did a 10,000 word booklet on my research. I looked at history and psychology. This is what I looked at. And when I went and they passed the history and the psychology interdisciplinary study, which I did at the access course in Cardiff. It was called colleague Glenn Afrin. And this is the presentation I was going to do at that time. And I actually thinking to myself, I was nervous and I didn't know whether I was going to pass because you have to pass the written, the oral as well. And I didn't know whether I would be able to pass the oral. So I'm thinking to myself, do I really want to teach? Do I really want to teach all this? This is what I was saying. I wanted to teach it maybe in group settings, but as a teacher in an auditorium and things like that, I wasn't too sure. So I was very nervous. So this is just to show you when I did my first, and the reason why it lasted for 3 years, because every time I submitted a paper in, they refused to take it because they were trying to say to me that try to identify mental illnesses with you during slavery. You can't do that because psychology was not around at the time. This is how they did. So they rejected my paper. I had to go back the second year and write another 10,000 words. They rejected it the second time. This is how I was treated. And then he accepted it the third time because I had to then force to use, and I was the only person at the college where I had to use history, psychology, and I had to add sociology to it. This is how they made me work.
Apobaga, it's just incredible the story that you're telling us. It's really, really incredible to think that all that you've gone through and got to where you are today.
So
Apobaga, right.
yeah. So sorry about this. It's really
It's all
emotional.
right. So we'll just be, you just wrap up in the way that you want to, and then
Okay.
we'll just be able to ask you some questions and make some comments because you've raised so many interesting points. Been absolutely fascinating.
Okay, so this is what happened. So if I would have failed the third time, they would have kicked me off the course. I would not have been able to get into university. So you can see the opposition I was against in Wales, from most institutions, from most teachers, from the time I entered school at the age of 4 years old, right up until I did the access course. I had to fight to get what I am. So the reality is the reason why I'm a multidisciplinary special or expert is because I've had to use different disciplines to prove my point. So that's the reason why, education is really important. And I never gave up on I wanted to give up on myself, but I didn't. I had to do it. I really had to do it. So that's basically it, really. So this is just information, just looking at some of the things which I had to go through and looking at the African Caribbean experience when I did my interdisciplinary study. Eventually they passed me. I had a top mark, had a distinction mark on my third time round. And the thing about it was that I was admitted into university, and really that's when my career really started off. But there was a lot of opposition, during my studies, etc., with the amount of uncoverings that I had to go through. But sorry for being emotional, and thanks for listening to my presentation. And I'll open up now for question and answers.
Okay, well, thank you so much. We asked you to tell us your story, and you have told us your story, and really appreciate the detail that you've gone into, and also you educated us, I'm sure, because there was a number of things that when you talk about them, I think, gosh, I just had no idea. And I've listened to a number of your presentations, Apabaga, over the last few years. And I've always got the great respect for you. And you are well respected in Wales now. You were the presenter to the Welsh Government for Black History Month. I think it was in 2019, was it? With a great film that you put together for that, and also the Black History Month training opportunities that you did last year when we all had to move on to online training. So very, very well respected. And your passion obviously just really comes through, but we understand more now why you have such a passion. You've had such a battle to educate yourself, and to take that responsibility because you really wanted to understand. And I was fascinated by the number of books that you've shown us, because that's one of the things that we've talked about before, is how can we help people to understand about Black history, to know more about the issues around Black Lives Matter, and what we can share. So then I think I'm fascinated as well by your reasoning, and your brother being a Rasta. Rastas are good at reasoning and making sense of history, but it's been acknowledged that you've done your research, and certainly you have. So just absolutely fascinating. And so I thank you again. It's it's great that you're supporting the Black History Lunchtime Conversations. We've really appreciated the sessions that you've joined us on, and we look forward to, season 3. We'll discuss the things that we're going to do there. But that was fascinating. So, all right, let's have some. Should we? Would you like to wrap up the recording now, Simon? Now we've thanked you, Apu. Okay. Yeah.